In early 1942, inside the Bell aircraft factory in Buffalo, there were tense moments that many engineers later remembered, and they showed how uncertain the future of the P-39 still was. The giant Bell aircraft factory in Buffalo fell silent. A sharp metallic clang echoed across the floor as a flight helmet hit the concrete, the sound cutting through the air like a warning. Standing under a newly finished P-39 on the production line, Captain James Morrison, his leather jacket still zipped tight, spoke slowly, each word dropping like a hammer. "Court-martial me if you want. But I'm not getting into that a plane that many pilots believed could be dangerous if it was used in the wrong way." A wave of tension spread across the hangar. Many American pilots were cautious about the Airacobra, especially after hearing reports about its spinning issues and poor performance at high altitude. The aircraft that American pilots called a death trap, a machine they believed was more dangerous to friends than to enemies, would soon become something no one expected. The favorite weapon of the Soviet Union's greatest aces, the plane that helped shoot down thousands of German aircraft, and the total number may have passed 10,000 when we look at the entire Eastern Front, and taught American engineers the lessons they needed to build the first jet fighters. So how did the worst become the best? Why did a rejected airplane in America become a legend in Soviet hands? The secret does not lie in the machine itself, but in a simple truth. Victory or failure depends on where you fight and how you choose to use the tools you have. In 1937, when Bell Aircraft's chief designer Robert Woods had first sketched the P-39, the concept seemed brilliant. Move the Allison V1710 engine behind the pilot, creating a more balanced weight distribution and reducing drag in the nose at the same time. Open up space in the nose for a 37mm cannon that could punch through armor plate, giving the fighter exceptionally heavy firepower for a single-engine aircraft. Add tricycle landing gear for better ground handling, which promised easier takeoffs and landings for less experienced pilots. Design a car door-style cockpit for easier entry, improving comfort and visibility on the ground. On paper, the P-39 looked modern, innovative, and well-suited to the future of air combat. The theory was sound. Every design choice followed logical engineering principles, and each feature solved a real problem seen in earlier fighters. Engineers believed that innovation itself would be enough to overcome any small drawbacks. The execution created problems nobody had anticipated. Those problems did not appear immediately, but they grew more serious as testing moved from drawings and wind tunnels into real flight conditions. The 10-foot drive shaft connecting the engine to the propeller vibrated constantly, transmitting oscillations through the fuselage and into the cockpit. At certain speeds, the shaking became so intense that instruments blurred and fine control inputs were difficult to maintain. Pilots who flew the P-39 described it as sitting on top of a washing machine running at full speed, an experience that increased fatigue and reduced confidence during long missions. Worse, the engine placement meant that pilots worried about dangers they could not see. Some pilots worried that an engine failure behind them might be harder to notice, although later experience showed that the rear-mounted engine did not significantly increase the risk of fire compared to conventional fighters. In conventional fighters, smoke, vibration, or oil leaks were visible almost instantly. In the P-39, trouble often announced itself too late. Some test pilots reported issues during early trials, and each report added to growing unease, making pilots increasingly unwilling to climb back into the cockpit. But the aircraft's most damning flaw appeared the moment pilots tried to gain altitude. Without a turbo supercharger, the engine lost power rapidly above 15,000 feet, where air combat increasingly took place during the war, leaving the P-39 struggling where air combat increasingly took place. German Messerschmitt Bf-109s cruised comfortably at 25,000 feet, while Japanese Zeros could also climb high when needed. A P-39 pilot often entered combat already at a disadvantage, fighting gravity as much as the enemy. An evaluation by Colonel Bruce Holloway and other officers confirmed what pilots already suspected. The careful, measured language masked a harsh reality. The P-39 appeared fundamentally unsuited for high-altitude interception. Its ceiling seemed inadequate, and its handling characteristics at altitude raised serious concerns. Holloway could not, in good conscience, recommend this aircraft for combat operations against the Luftwaffe. That assessment should have killed the program. But cancelling the P-39 would have meant shutting down an entire manufacturing operation, wasting valuable resources, and delaying production at a moment when the United States needed every available fighter. Time was the one thing America did not have. So the factories kept running, producing aircraft that many American and British pilots did not prefer to fly, especially on high-altitude missions, but which were accepted because there were few alternatives and the war demanded aircraft immediately. In wartime, necessity often outweighs perfection, and the P-39 became a clear example of that reality. As the war expanded, commanders searched for roles where the P-39's weaknesses mattered less and its strengths could still be useful. At lower altitudes, where air was thicker and the engine could deliver full power, the aircraft handled better and felt more responsive. Its heavy nose-mounted cannon, once seen as an ambitious design choice, proved devastating against ground targets and lightly armored aircraft. In these conditions, the P-39 was no longer struggling to survive. It was fighting on terms it could manage. This shift in role quietly changed the aircraft's reputation. While Western Allied pilots often judged fighters by their ability to escort bombers at high altitude, other fronts demanded different capabilities. On the Eastern Front, for example, combat frequently took place at lower levels, where quick reactions and strong firepower mattered more than ceiling. In that environment, the P-39 found a second life, not as an interceptor, but as a lethal tactical fighter. The aircraft also forced pilots to adapt their tactics. Instead of climbing to meet the enemy, P-39 pilots learned to stay low, conserve energy, and strike when conditions favored them. They avoided prolonged vertical combat and relied on sudden attacks, using the aircraft's stability at speed and its powerful armament to end fights quickly. Survival depended less on raw performance and more on discipline and situational awareness. In this way, the P-39 revealed a deeper truth about wartime aircraft design. No airplane is inherently good or bad in isolation. Its value depends on how, where, and by whom it is used. The P-39 failed to meet the original expectations placed upon it, but it was never entirely useless. Instead, it became a lesson in compromise, adaptation, and the cost of betting too heavily on unproven ideas during a moment when failure carried real human consequences. By the time newer fighters replaced it in frontline units, the P-39 had already left its mark, not as the aircraft its designers hoped for, but as the aircraft the war demanded at that moment. Then came an unexpected lifeline from halfway around the world. Joseph Stalin's empire was bleeding under the weight of Operation Barbarossa. By spring 1942, the Soviet Union had lost thousands of aircraft and many trained pilots, and its air force was still struggling to recover from the first shock of the German invasion, entire air armies destroyed. Through the Lend-Lease program, Stalin made his needs clear. He needed fighters immediately, in massive quantities, and he wasn't particularly concerned about their pedigree. In Washington, someone had an idea that might have seemed either brilliant or simply practical. Send the Soviets the P-39s. Keep the P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts for American and British pilots. American officials saw that the Soviets needed many fighters as soon as possible, and they decided that the P-39 could meet those needs because it worked well at low altitudes. The journey those first P-39s made was almost as unlikely as everything else about their story. Many of the first P-39s for the Soviet Union were delivered through the Alaska-Siberia route, where American pilots flew the aircraft to Alaska and Soviet pilots took them across Siberia. Depending on the route, the delivery could take several weeks through Alaska or several months through the Persian corridor. German submarines threatened many supply ships, and losses on the Atlantic routes were common during 1942. Others were damaged in transit. But by late summer 1942, the first Airacobras were arriving at Soviet airbases. Soviet pilots approached the P-39 without preconceptions. They didn't know it was supposed to be a failure. They didn't care about high-altitude performance because the air war over the Eastern Front was fought primarily below 10,000 feet. German Stukas dive-bombed Soviet positions at low level. Soviet ground attack aircraft hit German tanks at treetop height. The desperate dogfights that characterized Eastern Front combat happened in thick air, where the P-39's Allison engine performed beautifully. At a test facility near Saratov in August 1942, pilots who'd survived the opening months flying obsolete 16 fighters discovered something unexpected. At 5,000 to 12,000 feet, the altitude where Eastern Front combat actually occurred, the P-39 was faster than many German fighters. At 10,000 feet, a P-39 could reach 360 miles per hour, while a Bf-109F at the same altitude managed only 342. Senior Lieutenant Grigory Rechkalov, flying combat missions near Stalingrad in October 1942, filed a report that captured the growing enthusiasm. The American machine seemed heavy, but solid, he noted. It didn't climb particularly well, but it dove like a stone. The cannon was magnificent. He'd reportedly destroyed a Ju-88 that day with 3 shells, watching the entire tail section separate from the fuselage. The aircraft appeared to reward aggression and punish hesitation. That philosophy, aggression rewarded, hesitation punished, would become the foundation of Soviet Airacobra tactics. But it would take one particular pilot to fully unlock what the P-39 could do. Alexander Ivanovich Pokryshkin was born on March 6, 1913, in Novosibirsk, Siberia. His father worked in a factory. His path to becoming a pilot wasn't privileged or straightforward. He'd worked in a factory himself before finding his way to flight school. When the war began in 1941, Pokryshkin flew the I-16, a stubby fighter that Soviet pilots called the Donkey, with mixed affection and exasperation. Going up against Messerschmitts in an I-16 required more courage than most men possessed. Pokryshkin survived those early battles, but barely. He watched friends die, watched the Luftwaffe dominate Soviet skies with seemingly casual superiority. By January 1943, when his unit, the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, received its first P-39s, Pokryshkin had become a pilot who understood that survival meant fighting smarter, exploiting every advantage no matter how small. He circled his first P-39 slowly at an airbase near Krasnodar, studying the unfamiliar lines, the tricycle landing gear that looked strange compared to Soviet fighters. What he might have said to his ground crew that day has been suggested as something like, he studied the aircraft carefully, and believed that its strengths could fit the type of air battles fought on the Eastern Front. But for our war, this might be exactly right. Over the following weeks, Pokryshkin developed what he called his formula for air combat, a methodical approach built specifically around the P-39's capabilities. He usually fought at low and medium altitudes where the P-39 performed well, and he stayed just high enough to attack German aircraft from a better position, but still within the zone where the Allison engine performed well. From that altitude, watch for German aircraft below. When targets appeared, the attack sequence was always the same. Dive, building tremendous speed. Close to point-blank range, usually 100 to 200 meters. Fire a brief burst from the 37mm cannon offered strong firepower, but its slow rate of fire and handling issues meant it was effective mainly in the right situations, not universally devastating. The tactic turned the P-39's supposed weaknesses into strengths. High-altitude performance didn't matter when all your combat happened below 15,000 feet. The P-39 was not a high-altitude dogfighter, but at low levels it could turn well and deliver strong firepower when you attacked and escaped before the enemy could respond. Pokrishkin's personal score began climbing rapidly. 5 confirmed victories, then 10, then 20. His pilots learned to fight the same way, and the 16th Guards Regiment became one of the most effective fighter units in the Red Air Force. By spring 1943, German pilots were beginning to recognize Pokrishkin's radio call sign, 100, or STO in Russian. According to reports, the warning would reportedly go out on German frequencies. Some Soviet reports later claimed that German pilots recognized his call sign. Some German pilots, hearing that warning, would break off their attacks. The risk wasn't worth it when Pokrishkin was hunting. The proving ground came in July 1943, when Germany launched Operation Citadel near Kursk, the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front, and the largest tank battle in human history. The Germans committed 780,000 men, 2,700 tanks, and 2,050 aircraft. In the first hours of July 5th, Soviet fighters that met the Luftwaffe were mainly Yak and La-5 types, and the P-39 units joined the fighting later in the day and during the first week of the operation. Operation Citadel began at 4:30 a.m. on July 5, 1943, with an artillery barrage that lit up the pre-dawn sky. At 5 o'clock, the first Luftwaffe strikes began. Pokrishkin's regiment was airborne by 5:15. Historical records do not confirm a fight with this exact time and formation, but several similar engagements took place during the first days of the battle. Pokrishkin's P-39 rolled into a dive, building speed to over 420 miles per hour. At 150 meters, he fired. The 37mm cannon bucked. The lead Stuka exploded, turning into a fireball that tumbled toward Earth. Pokrishkin pulled up, using his dive momentum for a zoom climb back to 12,000 feet. The entire attack had taken less than a minute. The pattern repeated throughout that first day. German formations approached. Soviet fighters attacked from above, struck, and escaped. The Luftwaffe, which had expected to dominate Soviet skies, found itself constantly harassed by an enemy that appeared, struck with devastating effect, and vanished. During the first week, the entire 9th Guards Fighter Division, including the P-39 regiments, reported around 70 to 80 victories. In July 1943, Pokrishkin added several victories, but the number did not go higher than 10. On July 12th, at Prokhorovka, more than 850 tanks met in a single massive engagement. Both sides committed every available aircraft. On July 12th, P-39 units were active, but official records do not confirm that Pokrishkin flew 5 sorties or met German fighters in the exact formation described. Some reconstructions suggest that he may have ordered his pilots to break formation and dive. Follow me down. Engage below 12,000. As combat descended through 12,000 feet down to 8,000, the advantage shifted. At that altitude, the P-39s were faster, more responsive. Soviet pilots claimed 7 German aircraft. 2 P-39s were lost. Pokrishkin reached his 50th victory in mid-1944 after many later air operations, making him one of the highest-scoring aces in the entire war. And he'd done it flying the aircraft American pilots had refused to touch. Reports about the P-39's good performance on the Eastern Front had been reaching Washington since 1942, and interest grew steadily through 1943. The initial reaction was disbelief. The same aircraft rejected as unsuitable for combat was reportedly one of the most effective fighters in Soviet service. Some analysts dismissed it as propaganda, but the evidence kept accumulating. Soviet Lend-Lease requests specifically asked for more P-39s, not P-51s, not P-47s, but more Airacobras. In mid-August 1943, a Soviet request crossed desks at Army Air Forces headquarters, an additional 500 P-39s for 1944 delivery. The Soviets received small numbers of P-51s, but they focused their requests on P-39s because the Airacobra suited their low-altitude combat better. They wanted P-39s. American intelligence officers began interviewing captured German pilots. The Germans had their own opinions. One Luftwaffe pilot, shot down near Orel on July 15th, reportedly said something suggesting that Russian P-39s were far more dangerous than intelligence had briefed them to expect. A comparative study began to reveal the answer. Western Front air combat typically occurred at 20,000 to 30,000 feet. Eastern Front combat occurred at 8,000 to 12,000 feet. American doctrine emphasized sustained dogfighting. Soviet doctrine emphasized hit-and-run attacks. American pilots wanted multiple machine guns. Soviet pilots preferred heavy cannon. The P-39 wasn't a bad aircraft. It was an aircraft designed for the wrong war. In the right war, at the right altitude, with the right tactics, it was devastating. Despite this realization, American units did not use the P-39 in Europe, but they continued to fly it in the Pacific and in the Aleutian Islands. By late 1943, 78% of P-39 production went to the Soviet Union. The aircraft found its best use with the Soviet Air Force, even though few had expected that outcome. Just not the home anyone expected. While Pokrishkin and thousands of other Soviet pilots were proving the P-39 in combat, engineers at Bell Aircraft were absorbing a different set of lessons that would shape American aviation for the next generation. The design team, led by Robert Woods, probably held meetings in the same hangars where workers were still riveting together P-39s. They had to have been asking themselves difficult questions. What did we get right? What did we get wrong? And how do we make sure we don't repeat the mistakes? Some innovations, it turned out, were worth preserving. Tricycle landing gear, that strange configuration that had seemed so radical in 1941, proved itself in combat service. Soviet pilots reported that the P-39's landing gear made ground handling significantly easier than traditional tail-dragging designs. Visibility during taxiing was better. Takeoff and landing accidents were less common. Pilots with less training could handle the aircraft more safely. Bell carried tricycle landing gear forward into the P-63 King Cobra, an improved version of the P-39 that entered production in 1943. Lockheed adopted it for the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, which began development in 1943. North American used it on the F-86 Sabre, which would dominate the skies over Korea. By 1950, tricycle landing gear was standard on virtually every American fighter. The innovation that had seemed questionable in 1941 had become universal. Nose-mounted heavy armament, another P-39 innovation, also proved its worth. Mounting weapons on the aircraft's centerline meant no convergence problems. You aimed at a target, and the shells went exactly where you aimed. The 37mm cannon's devastating effectiveness in Soviet service validated the concept. Some early American jet fighters, like the F-80 and F-86, used nose-mounted weapons, but this layout did not become standard on all post-war designs. Car door-style cockpit entry, which had seemed almost frivolous in 1941, turned out to be practical and pilot-friendly. Easy entry and exit mattered in scramble situations. Better ergonomics mattered for pilot fatigue on long missions. The concept evolved into the bubble canopies and side entry designs that became standard on post-war fighters. But other elements of the P-39 design were clearly mistakes that needed correction. The mid-engine layout, with its long drive shaft, had created more problems than it solved. The vibrations, the maintenance complexity, the danger of engine fires, all of those issues stemmed from putting an engine in the middle of the aircraft and trying to connect it to a propeller 10 feet away. But here's where it got interesting. When jet engines came along, the mid-engine layout suddenly made perfect sense. Jet engines didn't need drive shafts. They produced thrust directly. Putting the engine in the middle of the fuselage, right where the P-39's engine sat, created excellent weight distribution and freed up space in the nose, for radar, for weapons, for fuel tanks. The P-80 Shooting Star, designed by Clarence Kelly Johnson in 1943, bore striking similarities to the P-39's layout. Both featured tricycle landing gear. Both emphasized pilot visibility. The P-80 carried its engine in the mid-rear fuselage, which was a different arrangement from the P-39's engine position, directly behind the cockpit. The critical difference was that the P-80's jet engine didn't need a drive shaft. The idea that had caused so many problems in the P-39 worked beautifully in a jet. The inadequate supercharging of the Allison engine taught a different lesson. Engine performance across the full operational envelope was critical. It wasn't enough for an engine to work well at sea level if it choked at altitude. Post-war American fighters placed enormous emphasis on consistent performance at all altitudes. Bell Aircraft applied these lessons to the P-63 King Cobra, which first flew on December 7, 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor. The P-63 used a stronger version of the Allison engine, but it still relied on a single-stage supercharger, so its high-altitude performance remained limited even though it performed better at low and medium levels, better aerodynamics, and modifications based on combat feedback from Soviet pilots. The P-63 never saw significant American combat service. Like its predecessor, it went primarily to the Soviet Union. 2,421 of the 3,303 P-63s built ended up in Soviet hands. Soviet reception was even more enthusiastic than it had been for the P-39. The aircraft was faster, climbed better, and retained all the characteristics Soviet pilots had learned to exploit. The real legacy of the P-39, though, wasn't in its own service, or even in the P-63. It was in every American fighter that came after. From a technical point of view, the F-86 did not develop directly from the P-39. It grew from broader aerodynamic research and the overall lessons learned during World War II. Tricycle landing gear that made ground handling safe and predictable. Emphasis on pilot visibility and cockpit ergonomics. Understanding that fighter design required careful balance between competing requirements. These weren't abstract principles. They were hard-won lessons, purchased with the embarrassment of rejection, with the surprised reports from the Eastern Front, with the gradual realization that the aircraft everyone had called a failure had taught American designers everything they needed to know about building the next generation of fighters. Alexander Pokrishkin's last recorded victory came earlier in 1944 because his unit did not take part in the final air battles over Berlin as Soviet forces closed in on the German capital. May 9, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Pokrishkin's final tally. Pokrishkin finished the war with a total that is usually given as 59 victories, although a few of his early successes were made in Soviet aircraft, before he switched to the P-39, primarily the P-39 Airacobra. That made him the second highest-scoring Allied ace of the entire war, behind only his fellow Soviet pilot Ivan Kodzydub, who achieved 62 victories. Pokrishkin received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award 3 times, the first Soviet pilot to achieve that honor during the war. The first award came in May 1943, after his innovative tactics had proven themselves. The second came in August 1943, after his performance at Kursk. The third came in August 1944, as Soviet forces pushed toward Germany. He rose to the rank of Marshal of Aviation, served as Deputy Commander of Soviet Air Defense Forces, wrote memoirs and tactical manuals that influenced Soviet aviation doctrine for decades. When he died in Moscow on November 13, 1985, he was remembered as one of the greatest fighter pilots in history. In his memoirs, and he wrote extensively about his wartime experiences, Pokrishkin repeatedly credited the P-39 as the finest aircraft he'd flown during the war. The American machine, he suggested, had rewarded skill while providing the weapons necessary for victory. The total Soviet P-39 service record is staggering: 4,746 aircraft delivered between 1942 and 1945, representing nearly half of all P-39s ever built. Soviet pilots flew them from Stalingrad to Berlin, from the frozen north to the Black Sea. Estimated victories against German aircraft run into the thousands. Exact numbers are impossible to verify, but German loss records and Soviet claims suggest the Soviet P-39s achieved many confirmed victories, probably numbering in the low thousands, although exact totals cannot be verified. These were the same aircraft that many Western pilots had considered unsuitable for high-altitude combat, the same fighters that some pilots complained about its handling at high altitude, but it continued to be tested and used. In American service, the P-39 compiled an entirely different record. No American aces achieved significant scores in the type. Combat use was minimal, relegated primarily to training units and a few squadrons in the Pacific, where low-altitude combat made the aircraft marginally useful. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Same aircraft, different contexts, opposite results. Today there are about 6 to 10 airworthy P-39s left in the world. They appear at air shows occasionally, flown by collectors and warbird enthusiasts. Perhaps a dozen more sit in museums, preserved as examples of World War II technology. At the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, a P-39 sits in the World War II gallery, its tricycle landing gear looking surprisingly modern even now, its 37mm cannon still mounted in the nose. The placard beside it typically describes the aircraft as unsuccessful in American service, but found success with Soviet pilots. That assessment, while accurate, misses the deeper significance of the aircraft's story. Many Russian aviation museums show their P-39s in fairly prominent places, especially in displays about the Eastern Front. Soviet veterans, in the years before they began to pass away, would gather at these museums for reunions. They called the aircraft Cobra, and they remembered it fondly, with the kind of affection veterans reserve for weapons that saved their lives and helped them win battles. The workers who built the P-39 in Buffalo, 4,500 of them at the factory's peak, probably never knew the full story of how their work mattered. They read the negative reports from American pilots. They heard the criticisms. They understood that the fighters they were building were considered failures. They could not know that on the Eastern Front, those fighters were making an important contribution to some of the hardest battles of the war, even if they were not the main reason the tide turned. They couldn't have known that decades later, aviation students would study the P-39 as a case study in the importance of matching aircraft design to the operational environment. Modern aviation designers still study the P-39, not as a failure, but as a teacher. The aircraft demonstrates something fundamental about technology and warfare. Success and failure are context-dependent. The best weapon in one situation may be useless in another. Innovation without proper application leads to disappointment, but proper application can transform failure into success. The standard narrative about the P-39 Airacobra calls it America's worst fighter of World War II, a failure that was dumped on the Soviets. Proof that American aircraft design could sometimes go catastrophically wrong. The actual story is more complex, more interesting, and ultimately more instructive. The P-39 was a revolutionary design mismatched to American operational requirements. It failed in American hands because it was being used wrong, in the wrong place, at the wrong altitudes. But it succeeded brilliantly in Soviet service because Soviet pilots used it right, in the right place, at the right altitudes. Some features, like the tricycle landing gear, showed forward thinking, while other parts of the P-39 did not become standard in the jet age. The P-39 played an important role in Soviet low-altitude fighter units and helped support the air superiority the Red Air Force gained from 1943 onward. It enabled the highest-scoring Allied aces to achieve their victories. Soviet P-39 pilots shot down more than 1,000 German aircraft, which was still a major contribution. Its contribution to Allied victory was significant, even if that contribution came in ways American planners never intended. More importantly, it taught American designers lessons that would shape aviation for the next generation. The P-39 gave later engineers a clear lesson about matching design to real missions, but it was not a direct ancestor of American jet fighters. The factory workers in Buffalo, building aircraft their own military rejected, demonstrated dedication that transcended disappointment. They maintained quality even when building machines nobody wanted. Their work mattered more than they ever knew. The test pilots who walked away, who refused to fly the P-39, weren't cowards. They were right to recognize the aircraft's flaws in the context where they would have flown it. In high-altitude combat, the P-39 would have been at a serious disadvantage and would not have survived well against German fighters. Their refusal was justified. The Soviet pilots who embraced the P-39 weren't settling for second-rate equipment. They were recognizing an aircraft that matched their needs perfectly. Their achievement was in seeing potential where others saw only failure. Alexander Pokrishkin, Grigory Rechkalov, Nikolai Gulaev, and thousands of other Soviet pilots transformed the flying coffin into a legendary weapon. They did it by understanding the aircraft's strengths, by developing tactics that exploited those strengths, by fighting smart instead of following doctrine that didn't fit their war. The P-39 story challenges comfortable narratives about technological progress and military superiority. It reveals that success and failure often depend entirely on context. The same design can be both inadequate and excellent depending on how it's employed. Innovation sometimes comes from unexpected sources, and the path from failure to success is rarely straight or predictable. They laughed at America's worst fighter. Soviet pilots made it legendary. American designers learned from its failures and successes alike. And in the end, the flying coffin that nobody wanted helped win the war and taught America how to build the future. That's a legacy worth remembering. If you found this story as fascinating as we did researching it, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We dive deep into World War II's most surprising stories every week, and there are dozens more tales like this one. Stories that challenge what we think we know about history. Your subscription helps us keep telling these stories the way they deserve to be told. See you in the next one.